15 years had passed since Mark had last stepped foot in his childhood home. Not because he didn't love his parents, but because he knew they wouldn't understand. He had heard them make anti-gay remarks growing up, and rather than risk rejection, he simply faded away. Calls stopped, letters never came, and life moved on. But then, he heard rumors from a few family members who had accepted him. His mother's health was failing. Despite everything, he had always been a mama's boy, and the thought of never seeing her again gnawed at him. That's what finally brought him back home. Now, standing on the front porch with his boyfriend, Daniel, Mark took a deep breath and knocked. The door opened almost immediately, as if his mother had been waiting by the door for years. "Mark?" she gasped, tears welling up in her eyes. "Hey, Mom." Without hesitation, she pulled him into her arms, sobbing into his shoulder. "I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered. Mark swallowed hard, trying to keep his own emotions in check. "I know. I'm sorry." Then, her gaze shifted to Daniel. "And who is this?" she asked, already smiling warmly. Mark took a deep breath. "Mom, this is Daniel, my partner." "Oh," she said, blinking. But then, without missing a beat, she pulled Daniel into a hug. "Welcome to our home." Mark exhaled, relief washing over him. One down, one to go. Behind her, Mark's father, Richard, stood stiffly in the doorway, arms crossed, face unreadable. "Hey, Dad." "Mark." His father's eyes flicked to Daniel for a brief moment before he stepped aside. "Come on in." The night was tense at first. Richard kept casting sideways glances at Daniel, but said little. Mark and his mother talked nonstop, making up for lost time, while Daniel did his best to be polite and engage in conversation. But Richard remained distant. It wasn't until Mark's mother stepped out of the room that Richard finally spoke up. "So, what am I supposed to tell my buddies at work?" Mark tensed. "Tell them whatever you want, Dad. It doesn't change who I am." Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. I never expected this." "Neither did I," Mark admitted. "But this is my life, and Daniel is part of it." His father didn't respond, just gave a small nod. It wasn't approval, but it wasn't rejection either. It was a start. Over time, things improved. Mark and Daniel visited more frequently. And though Richard never became overly affectionate, he no longer looked at Daniel like he was an outsider. When Mark's mother confessed that her health had been declining, they knew they had to make a decision. "We want you to move closer," she pleaded. "I don't know how much time I have left." And so they did. 3 years later, she was gone. The house felt emptier without her. Mark still visited often, but Richard remained somewhat distant. Something was still holding him back. Then, one day, everything changed. Mark and Daniel had decided to adopt. When they introduced their new daughter, Lily, to Richard, something shifted. His eyes softened, his posture relaxed, and for the first time in years, he smiled, genuinely smiled. "She's beautiful," he murmured, holding the tiny girl in his arms. From that moment on, Richard was a changed man. He doted on Lily and later, their second adopted son, Max. He was a grandparent Mark never imagined he'd be. And just like that, whatever had been missing all those years had been found. Richard never said it outright, but Mark finally understood. His father hadn't been distant because he was ashamed. He was grieving something he thought he'd lost: grandchildren, a legacy, a continuation of their family. But now, seeing Mark as a father, Richard knew that family wasn't defined by tradition. It was built with love. And in the end, that's all that mattered.